Okay, we are back. Next chapter is The Man I Killed. His jaw was in his throat. His upper lip and teeth were gone. His one eye was shut. His other eye was a staring shaped hole. His eyebrows were thin and arched like a woman's. His nose was undamaged, but there was a slight tear to the lobe of one ear. His clean black hair was swept upward into a cowlick at the rear of his skull. His forehead was lightly freckled. His fingernails were clean. The skin of his left cheek was peeled back in three ragged strips. His right cheek was smooth and hairless. There was a butterfly on his chin. His neck was open to the spinal cord, and there was blood there. It was thick and shiny, and with his wound that had killed him. He lay face up in the center of a trail, a slim, dead, almost dainty man. He had bony legs, a narrow waist, long, shapely fingers. His chest was sunken and poorly muscled, a scholar maybe. His wrists were the wrists of a child. He wore a black shirt, black pajama pants, a gray ammunition belt, a gold ring on the third finger of his right hand. His rubber sandals had been blown off. One lay beside him, the other a few meters up the trail. He had been born maybe in 1946 in the village of Maikee, near the central coastline of the Quang province. There where parents farmed and where his family had lived for several centuries, and where during the time of the French, his father and two uncles and many neighbors had joined in the struggle for independence. He was not a communist. He was a citizen and a soldier. In the village of Maikee and all of Quang, patriotic resistance had the force of tradition, which was partly the force of legend. From his earliest boyhood, the man I killed would have listened to stories about the heroic Trung sisters and Tran Hung Dao's famous rout of the Mongols and Li Loi's final victory against the Chinese at Tat Dong. He would have been taught that to defend the land was the man's highest duty and highest privilege. He had accepted this. It was never open to question. Secretly, though, it also frightened him. He was not a fighter. His health was poor, his body small and frail. He liked books. He wanted someday to be a teacher of mathematics. At night, lying on his mat, he would not picture himself doing brave things his father had done, or his uncles, or the heroes of the stories. He hoped in his heart that he would never be tested. He hoped the Americans would go away. Soon, he hoped. He kept hoping and hoping, always, even when he was asleep. Oh man, you fucking trashed fucker, Azar said. You scrambled his sorry self. Look at that. You did. You laid him out like shit by shredding fucking wheat. Go away, Kiowa said. I'm just saying the truth, like oatmeal. Go, Kiowa said. Okay, then I take it back, Azar said. He started to move away, then stopped and said, Rice Krispies, you know, on the dead test, this individual gets an A+. Sorry, got interrupted there for a minute. So, smiling at this, he shrugged and walked up the trail toward the village behind the trees. I kneeled down. Just forget that crud, he said. He opened his canteen and held it out for a while, and then sighed and pulled it away. No sweat, man. What else could you do? Later, Kiowa said, I'm serious. Nothing anybody could do. Come on, stop staring. The trail junction was shaded by a row of trees and tall brush. The slim young man lay with his legs in the shade. His jaw was in his throat, his one eye was shut, and the other was a star-shaped hole. Kiowa glanced at the body. All right, let me ask a question, he said. You want to trade places with him? Turn it all upside down? You want that? I mean, be honest. The star-shaped hole was red and yellow. The yellow part seemed to be getting wider, spreading out of the center of the star. The upper lip and gum and teeth were gone. The man's head was cocked at the wrong angle, as if loose at the neck. The neck was wet with blood. Think it over, Kiowa said. But then later, Tim, it's a war. The guy wasn't Heidi. He had a weapon, okay? It's a tough thing for sure, but you've got to cut out that staring. Then he said, maybe you better lie down a minute. Then after a long, empty time, he said, take it slow. Just go wherever the spirit takes you. The butterfly was making its way along the young man's forehead, which was spotted with small, dark freckles. The nose was undamaged. The skin on his right cheek was smooth and fine-grained and hairless. Frail-looking, delicate boned, the young man would not have wanted to be a soldier, and in his heart, he would have feared performing badly in battle. Even as a boy growing up in the village of Maikee, he had worried about this. He imagined covering his head and lying in a deep hole, closing his eyes and not moving until the war was over. He had no stomach for violence. He loved mathematics. His eyebrows were thin and arched like a woman's, and at school the boys sometimes teased him about how pretty he was. The arched eyebrows and long shapely fingers. And on the playground they mimicked a woman's walk and made fun of his smooth skin and his love for mathematics. The young man could not make himself fight them. He often wanted to, but he was afraid, and this increased his shame. Oops, sorry, my computer's there we go. If he could not fight little boys, he thought, how would he ever become a soldier and fight the Americans with their airplanes and helicopters and bombs? It did not seem possible. In the presence of his fathers and uncles, he pretended to look forward to doing his patriotic duty, which was also a privilege. But at night, he prayed with his mother that the war might end soon. Beyond anything else, he was afraid of disgracing himself and therefore his family and village. But all he could do, he thought, was wait and pray and try not to grow up too fast. Listen to me, Kiowa said. You feel terrible. I know that. And then he said, okay, maybe I don't know. Along the trail, there were small blue flowers shaped like bells. The young man's head was wrenched sideways, not quite facing the flowers, and even the shade of a single blade of sunlight sparkled against the buckle of his ammunition belt. The left cheek was peeled back in 3 ragged strips. The wounds at his neck had not yet clotted, which made him seem animate, even in death. The blood still spreading out across his shirt. Kiowa shook his head. There was some silence before he said, stop staring. The young man's fingernails were clean. There was a slight tear in the lobe of one ear, a sprinkling of blood on the forearm. He wore a gold ring on the 3rd finger of his right hand. His chest was sunken and poorly muscled, a scholar maybe. His life was now a constellation of possibilities. So yes, maybe a scholar. And for years, despite his family's poverty, the man I killed would have been determined to continue his education in mathematics. The means for this were arranged, perhaps. Through the village liberation cadres, in the 1964, the young man began attending classes at the University of Saigon, where he avoided politics and paid attention to the problems of calculus. He devoted himself to his studies. He spent his nights alone, wrote romantic poems in his journal, took pleasure in the grace and beauty of differential equations. The war, he knew, would finally take him, but for the time being, he would not let himself think about it. He had stopped praying. Instead, now he waited. And as he waited his final year at the university, he fell in love with a classmate, a girl of 17, who one day told him that his wrists were like the wrists of a child, so small and delicate, and who admired his narrow waist and cowlet that rose up like a bird's tail at the back of his head. She liked his quiet manner. She laughed at the freckles and bony legs. One evening, perhaps, they exchanged gold rings. Now one eye was a star. You okay? Kiowa said. The corpse lay almost entirely in the shade. There were gnats at the mouth, little flecks of pollen drifting above his nose. The butterfly was gone. The bleeding had stopped except for the neck wounds. Kiowa picked up the rubber sandals, clapped off the dirt, bent down to search the body. He found a patch of rice, a comb, a fingernail clipper, a few soiled piastres, a snapshot of a young woman standing in front of a parked motorcycle. Kiowa placed these items in his rucksack, along with the gray ammunition belt and rubber sandals. Then he squatted down. I'll tell you the straight truth, he said. The guy was dead the second he stepped on the trail. Understand me? We had him all zeroed. A good kill, weapon, ammunition, everything. Tiny beads of sweat glistened on Kiowa's forehead. His eyes moved from the sky to the dead man's body to the knuckles of his own hands. So listen, you pull your shit together. You can't just sit here all day. Later he said, understand? Then he said, 5 minutes, Tim. 5 more minutes and we're moving out. The one eye did a funny twinkling trick, red to yellow. His head was wrenched sideways as if loose at the neck, and the dead man seemed to be staring at some distant object beyond the bell-shaped flowers along the trail. The blood at the neck had gone a deep purplish black, clean fingernails, clean hair. He'd been in the village, he'd been a soldier for only a single day. After his years at the university, the man I killed returned with his new wife to the village of Waikiki, where he enlisted as a common rifleman with the 48th Viet Cong Battalion. He knew he would die quickly. He knew he would see a flash of light. He knew he would fall dead and wake up in the stories of his village and people. Kiowa covered the body with a poncho. Hey, you're looking better, he said. No doubt about it. All he needed was time, some mental R&R. Then he said, man, I'm sorry. Then later he said, why not talk about it? Then he said, come on, man, talk. It was a slim, dead, almost dainty young man of about 20. He lay with one leg bent beneath him, his jaw on his throat, his face neither expressive nor inexpressive. One eye was shut. The other was a star-shaped hole. Talk, Kiowa said. Okay, I don't know if you've ever been in a moment of really high shock, terror, death, but time seems to slow down and you tend to be really focused on strange little details to the exclusion of everything else. And I think you're seeing that with Tim's first man that he has knowingly been the one who killed. That all he could see was the body and imagine what this person had done and lived through and might have lived through had he not been dead at Tim's hand. Okay, we will meet for the next chapter.